Hello, good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. How
Good.
about you?
Doing well. We've got a larger crowd here today.
Oh, who all have we got? We got Jim and yourself, Gary Coulter, and I don't know who Miles Loomis is and who's Ozcall.
Mike, he recently joined, been active in the collab,
Oh, cool.
and has been attending many of the sessions we have over there. And
Awesome.
yeah, I put out an announcement this morning regarding the Casper Standup, and that seemed to have attracted more people.
Oh, great. Well, thank you,
Yeah,
Steve. I really appreciate it.
yeah.
Really. Um,
And Ozcall, I haven't met yet.
okay. All right. Well, Kent, you want to go first?
Sure. So last week worked on the Genesis ceremony optimization. Um,
That turned out to be an
so
interesting little puzzle.
yes, it has really been. So taking off the or making all the costs constant in the cost accounting chargeable trait
Uh huh.
has shaved off around 3%.
Okay. All right. So that wasn't a big win.
Yeah, but we do have much more accurate, um, a much more accurate benchmarking unit test. So,
Oh, good.
like, I'm pretty confident about that 3%. There's not much of a deviation.
That's
Um,
really nice to know, actually. It's
yeah.
really so getting rid of so the comma events do not represent such a huge overhead.
The com events one more time.
Well, I mean, what I had asked Joe to do was to um, inline with Scala code so that we removed all the comma events, at least for the creation of the vaults.
Hmm. Yeah, that could have um a moderate impact, I feel.
Yeah, I mean the biggest impact. Did you see what Pavel discovered?
Um, the so Paul, I talked with him, and he discovered that increasing the heap size would reduce the number of garbage collections, but this is on top of Joe's PR that tried to that pretty, I guess, um, yeah, did a lot of aggressive inlining, except um,
He didn't do the batching, and I talked about it privately afterwards. There's a way to do the batching that doesn't involve a join, but
mhm,
um, anyway, so the actually the thing that Paul discovered was um, there's a um, the the um, the try map is growing um, very large, like 20 gigs. They measured it at, and and it's holding a whole bunch of pointers. So those pointers are all in old space because it's a long-lived process. And so when so much memory is consumed, what was happening was it was running. It would see that there are all these pointers in old space, and it would, say, "Oh my gosh, we're out of memory. I better try to clear up something in old space." And then it would run a full GC, stop the world, run GC kind of thing. And then at the end of it, it would be like, "Oh my gosh, we're out of memory. We need to clear up old space." because all the pointers in the try map were essentially being held in a persistent way. So so each GC was not freeing up any memory, and so it was spinning its wheels with this stop the world run GC situation. So by adding heap, it was not in this mode of spinning its wheels. It wasn't trying to run this stop the world GC calculation over and over and over again. So they were able to get sub 1 hour times for 36,000 vault creations.
Yeah, so apparently that was mostly because of Joe's PR, like the way he did the inlining, but wasn't execute like there's like apparently a small bug in the way he inlined, such that we're not actually creating the vaults under what he has. So we're probably gonna have to give that a re-benchmark.
Okay, so we don't have any solid numbers.
Well, so this is just a new discovery. So
Yeah,
yeah, like
hang on 1 second. I've got an incoming call from my family member. 1 second. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. So you just discovered that there's a problem with Joe's code, and the vaults weren't actually being created.
yes. Well, our Arthur did, but yeah. So like essentially, yeah. Well, I don't know.
Can you say a little
Maybe.
bit more about this?
Well, so the push channel returns a either, apparently, and so we needed to have, or sorry. We were assuming it returns an either in like a Rolang either, but it doesn't. So I mean that should be a quick fix, and we should get an update on how it now performs.
Yeah, that's a very quick fix.
Yes. So I mean, I don't know. It could be that maybe that doesn't really matter.
Yeah, well, I'd really like to know, right? Because I was hoping we could, we had enough timing, improvements that we could, get this feature out across the finish line.
Yep. And so the other part that I wanted to say is trying to mess around with the Monix scheduler, like switching the batch size, upping and downing, or sorry, I mean like changing the type from like a fork join pool, didn't seem to really affect the unit test execution speed.
Yeah, I'd heard that. I can't remember who I heard it from, but I'd heard that that Monix was behaving correctly, so we shouldn't expect that to be much of a change.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, this either thing seems really like it's a one-line fix. We should be able to run the test right away.
Oh yes,
It-
for sure.
okay.
I'm sure we'll get a report from either Arthur or Joseph in an hour.
Oh, good. Okay, that's what I need to hear. That's what I need to hear. uh, good. All right. Well, I can give a sketch of the square root stuff. I don't have the slides ready, but I can walk through what's going on, since there are there's fresh meat here. Unless is there any other updates on your side?
Nope.
Okay. All right. So one of the things that is really cool about the process calculi in general is that they enjoy a number of operations that are analogs of arithmetic operations. The par, for example, is a lot like a multiplication. It's sort of somewhere between an addition and a multiplication. Um, and uh, and because of these features, we can take guidance from arithmetic on certain kinds of the existence of certain kinds of operations and expectations about their behavior, and that's really helpful, right? It's I mean, in general, the reason I turn to mathematics to provide guidance is to provide guidance on the software development. When we're building complex systems, especially large-scale distributed systems, the complexity quickly goes through the roof. I mean, quickly we get, even just in concurrency situations, one of the things that we find is that um, repeatedly is that the complexity is bigger than even the kind of expertise that seasoned developers have. So so there's lots and lots of data in the literature on this, which is why formal methods, especially in a concurrency setting, is recommended. And the process calculi provide I want to be cautious, but certainly under certain metrics, they provide the best kind of guidance and support for reasoning about concurrent and distributed systems. And I am so I have been looking at using mathematics for these kinds of things. I'm sorry, arithmetic as a guide for looking at the process algebra properties for a long time. And I noticed, oh my gosh, it was around 2002. I was out at Harvard meeting with Walter Fontana and another one of the process calculi folks who were getting into using process calculi for reasoning about biological stuff. But I was just sitting there waiting to begin a meeting, and I spotted that you could define the square root of a process. And the square root of a process is one in which you, if you have, if P is your process, then the square root of P would be the process such that square root of P in parallel with square root of P is bisimilar to P. So if you make two copies of this process, then it gives you the behavior that P gives you, which is kind of interesting, right? because what it's saying is it's giving you a kind of fault tolerance. And in fact, in general, the nth root of a process will be in copies in parallel with each other is bisimilar to p. Now, for me, it was a mathematical curiosity. I wasn't really thinking about it in terms of its implications for fault tolerance until just a few months ago, when I was thinking about, well, that's exactly what Casper does. We have in nodes, all of whom should be copies of each other. And when they run in this way, we get this kind of fault tolerant behavior because they're behaving in concert. They're behaving as if they are a single process that's coming to an agreement about a course of action. So there's a clear connection between this idea of the square root and consensus. Now, in the case of the pi calculus, you can give a crisp definition of the square root, but because of the way nu works, it's not so obvious or easy to define an algorithm that will calculate the square root. So that's something that I wanted to investigate again, which is what I was doing a few months ago, was just investigating this idea of the square root in the row calculus setting, where we don't have a new operator, where the new operator is a defined thing in terms of the reflection capabilities. So let me just stop there and just make sure that this idea makes sense to folks who are listening.
I'm following in a general sense.
Okay. All right.
Super cool, Greg. Thanks so much.
Oh, is that Vlad?
Hey, yeah, it's me. I've been in a few research rabbit holes the last month or two simultaneously, so I've been kind of neglecting pretty much all my communication responsibilities.
Oh,
Hey,
okay.
everyone.
Hey, Vlad, how are you?
Hey, good to see you.
I'm well. I'm excited to share some things, but I'm excited to hear more about this square root operation and the idea that somehow if you part Casper with Casper, you get another Casper in some way.
Yeah.
Or I'm sorry, you get square root something.
So if you par a copy of a particular process with itself, then the idea is that that it will be equal to something a little bit larger than itself. And the question is, what's the sort of wrapping that's associated, the calculation that gets you this thing, and that calculation is where Casper would live. Like the calculation of square root it should be some kind of definition of a consensus. It turns out, like, so again, if we just
like the nth root being the term in a consensus protocol for n node n validators. Maybe?
So the nth root is invalidators. That's correct. Yeah, that's exactly right. But when you par them all together, they don't give you validator behavior. They give you the behavior of the processes that they're providing consensus about. Right? So
but somehow together they're bisimilar. Shouldn't they be bisimilar? Like any n of m of them be bisimilar.
So the n to n in par together will be so what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure that everyone agrees on the behavior of some process P. Okay, so that's what the consensus is doing for us, right? The consensus is causing all of these different copies of machines that are simulating or executing or running P to all agree on P's behavior. Okay, so if you have n copies of these things all running in par, then those processes are causing one copy of P to be run. So those N copies in par will be bisimilar to P up to the observations associated with P itself. Like if you add other observations up, obviously it won't be bisimilar. But if you're just focused on what's going on with P, that's where your bisimulation comes in. Does that make sense?
Not quite. I didn't understand the last part. Sorry. So
let's go through it really slowly, right? So the idea is
what questions what questions are P about P am I allowed to ask? I didn't understand the last part.
Okay, so so you only get to look at the names that are associated with P, not with any sort of extraneous names like that, the out of channel names that the other processes, the N copies, the nth root processes might create in order to coordinate amongst themselves. So if you're just focusing your behavior on the your observations on what P does, so that's the free names associated with P. Those are the things that you can observe, not any sort of extra communications that amongst the nodes that would cause them to come to an agreement, right? You just look at the behavior that, you know, it's like you're disassembling P into N pieces, right? And all of those pieces are exactly the same, just like, you know, an nth root. And you're running them, and you're only looking at the behavior of those pieces as relates to how P behave, not, you know, what they might do, what any coordination amongst them that might be used to create agreement. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
But so somehow, like, I don't see how that ties into the definition of bisimilarity and square root.
Okay. So what you're saying is that when you put each of these N pieces together in par, the behavior of that process is bisimilar to P. So that's the definition, right? And so since you're talking about bisimilarity to P, that's where this restriction on, you know, what free names you look at comes in. If you're talking about bisimulation to Q, you might look at other free names, right? But since we're talking about P,
okay, we're talking about
these N copies are you're only observing them up to P. And the reason we have to make this kind of distinction, which we don't have to make in pi, is because in rho, the entire universe of names is visible, right? Like there are no names that are hidden in the sense that you know up front the entire universe of names, which is the case, for example, with TCP/IP. You know all TCP/IP ports now, but you don't necessarily know which ones a particular Unix process is using, which is why you run, you know, these kinds of port guessers, right? These port scanners that check for activity across a range of ports. So in that sense, rho and TCP are very, very similar. Does that make sense? Anybody?
Yeah, sorry, I was just muted.
Okay. All right. Okay. So that's how they're related. The nth root of a process, when you put it in par with itself n times. So in the case of the square root, it's 2 copies. Then that particular par should be bisimilar to the original process. Now, the interesting thing is that in general, this construction, you know, like if the square root of 0 should just be 0, and you can just proceed down the down the structural pieces of the process until you hit two kinds of things. One is when you hit an IO event, and the other is when you hit a par. And when you hit an IO event, what you really want is two copies of that IO event. And you're going to shuffle the names that they're operating on into different namespaces, right? So you'll get two copies, and the things are shuffled into their own namespace, so to speak, so they can act without interfering with each other, right? And the other thing you need to do is you need to look at a par and determine where the races are. If you have a process of the form P par Q, and P is entirely isolated from Q, then you can push the square root through. So if under the assumption that P shares no free names with Q, then the square root of P par Q is equal to the square root of P par the square root of Q. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm following.
Cool. Now, and this is very similar to the kind of arithmetic information that we have, right? So the square root of A times B, right? Under certain assumptions about negative numbers and imaginary numbers and other kinds of roots of unity, essentially. You can push the square root across the multiplication. So that's kind of neat. That's nifty, right? Now the other case is when we have some tangle of races. So in that case, you have to ensure that that all of the copies agree on the winner of the race. Does that make sense?
So they have to agree on the copies, the winner of the race. And are you about to so I guess you're leading up to how they come to that agreement?
Yes, of course I am. But first, I
okay.
just want to make sure that people follow the line of reasoning, right?
All right.
So because mathematics is mostly about lots of boring steps.
Right. So
that every step in the argument is like, yawn. Of course. Why are you talking to me about this?
Gotcha.
Where's all the magic, right? That's like a mathematical argument. In some sense, in other senses, it might be beautiful and exciting, but in some sense, it should be like a Bach cello suite, right? Like the key is changing, but at no point do you go, oh wow, that was a really weird key change. At every step, it's completely mellifluous and consonant, and you're like, oh yes, of course, this is exactly how this should proceed. So this is what I'm doing. I'm just trying to make sure that everyone is in agreement that we can divide the par into you can divide the par into two cases. One case is an obvious case where they're isolated, so we can just push the square root through, and there's no surprises. The other case is when you have a race, and the reason I say race and I say tangle is because you might have, m output expressions and n input expressions for comprehensions. So n sends and n receives. The other way around. M sends and n receives, all on the same name. So I call that a tangle because they're all sort of all tangled up together, and you don't necessarily know which one is going to go with which. And even after you pick one winner, you might still have more more interaction that could go forward, right? So it doesn't necessarily get rid of all the contention. It just reduces some of the contention after you've picked a winner. So, so that's the general situation. And now it turns out that you can that there's a you can represent this as a summation. So you can insist on a particular kind of summation across a bunch of different distinguished names. So you can pick, you can for each possible winner, you can sort of name it as its own instance. So again, for each contender, you have a variant of the name that's sort of in its own namespace, and then you sum over all of these possibilities, and that will suffice to for everyone to agree on the winner, because you have because the summation will effectively pick a single winner. Now, in some sense, this should not be mathematically satisfying, because you're going, well, yes, but what's the algorithm that does the summation? And again, I'm proceeding in steps here. Like, I just want to make sure that everyone understands. So in process calculi, we have a notion of summation. It's typically a higher order notion, in the sense that all summations can be reduced down to can be reduced down to a simpler calculus, except, and this is where things get interesting, in the case of mixed summation. So Katusia Palmedisi proved that there's no par preserving summation, a reduction for mixed summation. So if you can sum over mixed expressions of inputs and outputs, and that's the case here, is that we end up having to do a mix of inputs and outputs, then the reduction down to the simpler calculus cannot be par preserving. So you don't get to turn pars into pars. And this is exactly the same as what's going on with the error correcting codes work that I had done before, where pars represent synchronization regions. There's sort of big, you can think of it as big chunks where synchronization may happen. And the fact that you can't reduce this mixed summation in a par preserving way says that the summation is adding synchronization constraints, and those synchronization constraints affect what can be considered potentially acausal. Right? In a par, you could have A come before B or B come before A. That's an acausal situation. It's a lot like what's called a space-like distance in general relativity, because you have this unordered events. So let me just stop there and see if that makes sense.
Maybe if I repeat it in the way I understand it. So you, with this, after you create the summation and you want to break it down into the smaller elements, that in a sense is has properties of the error correcting code, creating these restrictions that we're looking for. So am I kind of getting the gist?
Yes, that's right. So whether or not we use error correcting codes to express these synchrony constraints is a separate issue, right? That's from
Okay.
this perspective, it's just an implementation technique.
Okay.
The main point is that the lack of par preservation in getting rid of mixed summation
Mhm.
is exactly the introduction of these synchronization constraints. So now we have this. Now we're tying in this
Okay.
beautiful mathematical work by Palamidisi directly into consensus. And in fact, if you look at her examples, all of her examples are leader election in her famous paper. They're all about leader election, not necessarily because those were the only examples, but because they were easy to get the point across. But now we're starting to see like all of these pieces come together in this lovely way, right? So we have this abstract characterization, just like what's the nth root of a process, right? You know, who would think that has anything to do with consensus? I certainly didn't. I was looking at this entirely in terms of guidance from arithmetic, and now the basic calculation is leading us into the territory of Palamidisi's paper and right in the middle of leader election. So this is very beautiful. It's totally unexpected, and I mean I can go into more of the details, but we now have 20 minutes before the hour, and maybe I'll you know, introduce some narrative tension so people will come to the RCast, and hand it over to Vlad, who has some exciting updates apparently.
Sounds good. My takeaway was that basically somehow, you know, and that like, you know, PAR needed to be, you know, like representative and sense protocol, like somehow differently than just running things in parallel.
Well,
and different validators.
It's a little bit more than that. It's specifically the algorithm that you use to get rid of mixed summation can't preserve pars. So you can preserve pars if you don't have any mixed summation. So you just like you're translating along, right? So you have this calculus that uses summation, and every case is just sort of, you just push it through until you hit mixed summation, where you've got a summation of an output with an input, and then at that point you have to invoke some extra synchrony stuff. That's, you know, when you have one of those in a par, then you have to do something. You have to do something extra, which will not preserve the par. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. I think so, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Cool. So,
basically because the summation represents like a choice that
yes, it represents
and therefore it could sacrifice confluence.
That's right. That's exactly it. Yes, very good. Cool. So I'm looking forward to you know, giving a lot more of this with slides in the ArcCast this week. But you know, so consider this a teaser.
Very good.
Okay, so Vlad, you said you had some outputs, some results.
Yeah, so I've got a bunch of things that I've been working on in the last few weeks. I've been working on partially synchronous liveness proof and strategy. And I've been working on methodology toolset, like a formal toolset for type fault tolerance analysis. Because, you know, I've been doing, and like all of the CC Casper stuff has been based on type fault tolerance analysis from the start, but I've never formalized any of the methodology. I've just kind of been using it without formalizing it, based on, you know, intuition gained from doing type fault tolerance analysis, as is natural to do in blockchain settings. So I have, let's start with type fault tolerance analysis stuff, because it's a little bit more abstract and more general. So imagine you have some. I'm going to define some things in terms of terms in a reduction system. You know,
Did we lose Vlad?
Yeah, I'm not hearing him. I was wondering if I was the only one.
I heard an ambulance in the background.
Well,
Hopefully.
hopefully that was just
Yeah.
the background.
Well, I think I
Wow.
heard him trying to get it. All right.
You guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
There we go.
All right. Sorry about that. I my phone connected to a Wi-Fi network, and then I just connected it. And it takes a while to figure out what's going on. So I was saying that the terms that I'm about to define can be defined in terms of row calc terms, but it's in general in terms of some kind of rewrite system, some reduction system. So two terms in a reduction system are independent if their execution traces are independent of each other in the sense that if they take any trace on one, it doesn't change the traces that are available to the other. So they're kind of completely independent of each other in that case, but one of them is independent of another if, say A is independent of B, if whatever B's trace is, whatever way that B is reduced over time, doesn't influence A's protocol executions at all.
Yeah.
Or like doesn't
The simple way to say this is they share no red X's.
share no red X's. Interesting. Okay. Well, so this isn't a symmetric relationship. So A is independent of B, and I could say B is independent of A, or they're independent of each other. I want to say that they're mutually independent.
Yeah, understood.
And now we say that A is gated by G from B if A is independent of B, assuming that G experiences no reductions. So, like, assuming that like G is fixed, then A is independent of B, then somehow G was, if there's any way for B to talk to A, it was through G. So this is like a notion of gating, and a term A is called gate, so term B is called gate substitutable with B prime. If I change B with B prime, it's A is gated from B prime. And furthermore, we have a relationship, an equivalence class between the gate substitutable terms that has to do with A having the same transitions available to it. So, if B and B prime, if the reductions available to A given the term B prime are the same as the reductions available to A given the term B, then B and B prime are equivalent. And this equivalence relation lets us kind of, in some way, think about, or will, in a moment, let us think about the types of Byzantine faults that are possible. So
I'm not sure I understand your definition. Can you restate it, please?
Sure. So two terms are gate equivalents. So for term A behind a gate G, two terms B and B prime are gate equivalents. Firstly, they're gate substitutable. So they're both gated by, if they replace B with, A is gated from B prime by the gate if you replace B with B prime.
Okay, but how is the term gated?
It's independent. A is independent of B if the gate is fixed. So if G doesn't experience any reductions, then A is independent of B.
That's the part that I'm not following. So does G interact with A?
Possibly. I mean, potentially, yeah.
With A?
Potentially, yeah.
And G potentially interacts with B.
Exactly, yeah.
And
but if G is fixed, yeah.
So okay, so we pick a G, we fix a G, and then what?
And then we don't let G reduce. And then we say, is A independent of B? And if so, then
we don't let G reduce. Is G somehow put together? Do we form an AG term or a BG term?
a reduction might aim to do that in order to, for example, communicate, for example, between A and B, for example.
I'm just trying to figure out, like, what's the context? What's the syntactic context?
So, for example,
A and G or A.
For example, here's like an example that I'm going to use in a moment. Imagine that G checks if a signature from a validator list has been provided with a message before routing it onwards. So, you know, if you freeze that term, there might be some terms behind it which now are independent from some signature producing nodes. So the gate is like a term that's like independent of A and B in some sense. It's like, you know, so it's like in this example, it's like the signature verification gate in some way. And it only lets things through if there's a valid signature. And you might have like a term on one side sending signed messages and a term on the other receiving signed messages. So let's say that like
okay, so the gate is like a mediator. I can think of the gate as like a I can think of the gate as like a enhanced or expanded notion of channel. It's a proper. The gate will implement a property on a channel.
And so that's like an example that I'm using most commonly, but I don't know that that's entailed in the definition.
Okay, understood. But that's a paradigmatic example I can keep in mind.
Yeah.
Trying to reason about these things. Okay, cool.
So A is gated from term B if when the gate is frozen, A is independent of B. And if I can replace B with B prime, and B prime is gated from A, so like A is gated from B, sorry, right, B prime, then in some way that, like, you know, I can replace B with B prime and still get a gated term. So I call B prime gate substitute rule for B.
Yeah, for rewrite systems, you really need to talk about this in terms of how composite terms are formed, right? So you're really looking at some term K, which is parametric in A and
Of course.
G, right? And
of course.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm assuming that that's basically the context. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. It would yeah, it's helpful because then you can identify the context, right? Or you can say when you're quantifying over context, because that will have
so right now
that will have complexity consequences.
Sure. Yeah. So right now I'm just ignoring the context, and the context isn't really an issue exactly. I mean, it's gonna be relevant for the definition, but like only G is frozen in that when we're checking whether A is independent of B. So, anyways, bear with me. So there's an equivalence class that we can define based on how A's behavior from behind the gate is affected by changes in B's behavior. Essentially, if we replace B with some other term B prime, does A experience the same transitions? And if so, then B and B prime are equivalent, and they're part of the same equivalence class. And, you know, when A is thinking about B, they only need to think about like one equivalence class representative for, you know, each equivalence class of the possible B's they're concerned about. What we have in our kind of Byzantine fault tolerance setting is that, like, we have terms that are gated from Byzantine terms, and Byzantine terms basically could be running any term. So you can imagine that like a faulty term at any time could become any other term. And so this kind of completely undefined behavior, you know, we need to somehow, and we can, thanks to these gates, get type, you know, further defined by modeling as an equivalence class representative. You know, maybe even the canonical kind of equivalence class representative. Um, and so basically, let's do the signature gate. Imagine that I have a signature gate, as described before, where the gate checks if the message has a signature from our list of validators, and if it does, it lets the message through, and otherwise it doesn't. There could be a faulty term on the other side of this gate, but we can express that faulty term in terms of its as far as spectrum A goes, in terms of its equivalence class representative, which is, for example, it has many, but it has, for example, an equivalence class representative of a program that signs a message and then sends it through the gate. And that program is more defined than this fully undefined behavior that we had earlier. And so somehow this gate allowed us to type the Byzantine fault to some extent, right? We went from fully undefined behavior to some more defined behavior, namely something that's producing a valid signature. Now, technically, we don't really know or care how it's producing a valid signature. We just know that, like, if it's not producing valid signatures, then it's essentially the empty program or the null program for as far as A is concerned. Because the only way to get to A is through this gate, for this particular term. So basically, what I'm able to do is to say, okay, well, I have an equivalence relationship on terms, and I can find an equivalence class representative of the fully undefined term, which is going to be my type, or all of these are types for the Byzantine faults. And the nice thing about this is that it provides like a clear discipline and analysis for why and how, and why we can safely make this assumption that the Byzantine fault has a particular type. And the kind of canonical example of this is to show that with validity gates, the Byzantine fault, the type of unfold behavior is the equivocated.
That's nice. That's really nice. I like it. A couple of points. Your gate definition is really closely related to Tony Hoare's notion of failure semantics, so you might want to do a comparison between gates and failures, and in particular, there's a well-known result that all equivalence relations known factor through by simulation. So in particular, I would, if you were looking for a way to factor your equivalence relation through by simulation, you can get guidance from how failures factors through by simulation.
So you call it failure what? Sorry, failure what?
So a failure is essentially that there are some transitions that can't happen. There, contexts or situations in which a particular transition ceases to happen. So what Hoare does is it collects a trace up to a certain point, and then there's a place where the two processes diverge because one fails and the other doesn't. That's an intuitive way to talk about it, but it's a little. Yeah, I recommend just reading the.
Yeah, seems somewhat odd. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, what you're doing is you're looking at places where they're where two processes are isolated from each other, and then you're looking at contexts in which they are, in which isolation is essentially you're characterizing isolation contexts. So things up to a particular isolation context. And the reason I was saying be explicit about the context is because once you start writing down the context, then you can turn these types into ladle types. And that's how you'll make the connection between your notion of type and a ladle type.
Interesting. Yeah. So I don't know how much I need, what exactly I need for my definitions and proofs to work out. But I'm still investigating.
Cool. No, it's a nice line of investigation. I like it a lot. It's cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Another thing I'm working on is this partially synchronous Leibniz proof, and it's been pretty cool. It's a basically the high level idea is that we have something called a planner that every protocol states returns kind of extension of the protocol states or a representation of how the protocol states would be extended if everything were to go well. And the planners have certain properties that guarantee liveness. And nodes basically have to use planners to decide when they make their latest messages. And we kind of, and they have properties that they produce plans that, if they're executed correctly, are make decisions. And and have a way to calculate, given a particular plan in a protocol state, how long you have to wait until you make your next message. Given, like I have some constraints on how long you have to wait so that we have a liveness proof. It's very similar to the fault projection in a synchronous network, only now in a partially synchronous network, we have to forgive. In a synchronous network, when we detect someone faulty, you can just ban them forever. And so we have a pretty straightforward proof that we eventually have a stable connectivity graph. In the partially synchronous network, you can't really ban them forever because they might have just been correct. You have to ban them for some time and then forgive them. And then in our proof instead shows that we have a stable connectivity graph for long enough. And the connectivity graph basically describes which validators are communicating as if they're recognizing each other to be correct. So they're successfully waiting for each other's messages and sending each other messages. And so a stable connectivity graph for long enough is going to be enough to execute a plan correctly for long enough to make a decision. Is the rough outline of the proof and the setup.
Yeah. So the interesting bit is the long enough bit, right? One of the things that I was trying to do with the error correcting codes is to not have a long enough bit, because I don't want to have to depend upon some network times.
Yeah, I understand, and the thing is that I'm not sure how to do it otherwise without in protocol fault tolerance thresholds.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so what you have that's what the error correcting codes do, is they do in protocol fault tolerance.
Yeah, exactly, and I don't like that. Yeah.
Oh, you don't like in protocol fault tolerance? That's interesting.
Not at all. No.
That's cool. So we should get together face to face and and we can share each other's concerns. That would be really fun.
Yeah, in protocol fault tolerance, I think is it's a bug, not a feature.
Oh, that's really fascinating. I think it was just exactly the opposite, and I think the industry is really happy with TCP, where it's all about in protocol fault tolerance.
What do you mean? Like, what's the fault tolerance threshold of TCP? I don't understand.
Oh, exactly once in order.
Oh, but that's not.
That's a fault tolerance mechanism. It is precisely a fault tolerance.
Okay, but I mean, I don't know if that's exactly like analogous. It's not like Byzantine fault tolerance kind of.
Duplications, dropping, and reordering are faults. They're faults that an attacker uses, right?
Yeah, but they're trying to prevent those faults.
Yeah, in protocol fault tolerance. That's right.
So in protocol fault tolerance thresholds and a fault tolerant protocol are like two different things, right? So I want to have the protocol be fault tolerant at the client determined thresholds, instead of have the protocol architect determine the thresholds.
Understood. I've got stand up. I'm 1 minute late for, so I'm gonna drop here. But you guys keep going if you want. Thanks so much, Vlad. This is really fun. I'm really enjoying.
Yeah. So sorry, show up a little late. I'm gonna try to get back to attending. We'll see how I do.
Awesome. All right. Talk to you later.
Bye, guys.
Have a good day.